On the southern continent of Kisangani, to the west of the arm of the gods, lies the giant lake simply called the Holy Dam. In the center of the lake, there is a perfectly round, deep blue hole. The water of the hole is always clear, no matter the weather, nor yet the season. It is said that a diver who was brave enough, or foolish enough, could plumb those depths and find the hub of the wheel, which the goddess pushed out when she gave her people the gift of Habi. There are always young men and a few young women who try this on their temple day. Most survive the experience. None have found the hub. That little snippet comes from a lake in my world, the Holy Dam on the continent of Kisangani. Lakes are fascinating things. They are critical for fresh water. They provide a buffering effect on the weather, a temperate zone for people to live in. Their depths can hide monsters, magics, artifacts of terrible nature. They can be used in elemental magic, shamanistic magic, and in other forms of power generation. They can even be portals into other worlds. And they are the topic of my conversation with you today: lakes and how to use them in fantasy settings. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds. If you like this kind of topic and you would like to see me make more, you can support me on Ko-fi, or you can buy my books, links down below. Okay, let's get cracking. First, let's talk about how lakes are formed. Now, I'm not going to exhaustively cover every type of lake there is. I'm going to cover the ones that are most interesting to me. But just so that you understand the basic concept, a lake is basically formed anywhere where you've got a basin and some kind of input of water, whether that's a river flowing in or regular filling through rain, or an upwelling of water through the groundwater, or whatever the case may be. That then becomes a lake area in that basin. And a basin can be formed through glacial movements. Like an example is in Finland, we're called the land of 1,000 lakes. And that is basically because we have many, many basins caused by the glacial movement. When the glaciers retreated during the last ice age, they left these basins behind. Basins can also be created by wind movement. It can be created by meteoric strikes. So it can be this hole in the middle of nowhere, and any other number of causes. The ones that I'm going to cover today are the ones that I find most interesting. So let's kick off with that and talk about seas that get cut off from the ocean. An example of this from our world is the Caspian Sea. So the Caspian Sea used to be connected to the ocean proper. It used to be a sea that had an inlet to the ocean. But over time, whether through sedimental impact and landslides and so on, it gets cut off from the ocean. And then it becomes a salty lake. So right now, the Caspian Sea is still salty. But over time, it will probably become a freshwater lake as the minerals kind of descend into the earth and fresh water pours in with rain and rivers and so on. And it doesn't get the renewal of salt from the ocean that you would otherwise get. And so its salinity will go down and it will become a freshwater lake. The reason why I like these kinds of lakes is because they have the potential to be immense. So a sea inherently is a giant body of water. If you look at the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Red Sea, they're all very big pieces of water. Even the Baltic Sea, which is on Finland's coastline, is a massive body of water. If you then bar that from the ocean, you end up with this huge lake, which of course has the potential to be a great landmark, as well as being a resource for people to live around, as well as being a culturally impactful site. The location of such a sea, such an ocean, such a big lake would attract people. They would make up stories about it. They would tell their children about it. They would have magic that grows from that lake, things of cultural significance, worship, and so on. So I really like that kind of lake just for its sheer water size. And from inland seas, let's talk about lakes in volcanoes. So lakes can also form inside volcanoes. The volcano erupts, it leaves the crater. Water can then enter the crater either from glacial melt from higher down, or water, like falling from the sky, rainwater falling into the sky, snow falling into the caldera, etc. It can even come from the groundwater and the liquids inside the volcano, and it forms this round lake in the crater. What is really interesting about these lakes is because the water also seeps out, they can be intermittent lakes. So they can exist during the rainy season, then the water can seep out, leaving the caldera dry, and then they can fill up again. So it can be this intermittent thing. They also are quite often warm springs inside there because the heat of the volcano can still provide heat to the water. So that makes it a hot spring, which of course comes with a lot of cultural impact. People can go there for the good feeling of being in a hot spring, but also for things like healing. There can be a magic associated with it. If you have an elemental magic, this is also a very key place because you have the air, obviously, all around you. You have the volcano providing fire. You have the lake providing water. And you have the earth of the volcano and the mountains around it providing your earth element. So it's actually a nexus point of all four elements that can become an immense place of power in such an elemental magic system. So definitely worth thinking about volcanic lakes from the aspect of an elemental lake. They're also some of our weirdest lakes. So Ojos del Salado in Chile has a permanent lake at a height of 6,000 meters above sea level. It's probably the highest lake in the world. The biggest crater lake is in Indonesia, and it was from an eruption that happened 75,000 years ago, and it's 100 kilometers by 300 kilometers wide and long. And at its deepest point, it is 505 meters deep, which is enormous. I mean, that is one heck of a lake. And that's why I like caldera lakes or volcanic lakes. I like them for their elemental impact. I like them for the strange and unusual places they can be in. I like them for all of the elements that come around them, the heat, the hot rocks, the strange volcanic environment, and then this blue lake in the middle of the volcano. And speaking of volcanoes often come along with earth subsidence. And that is one of the other ways in which you can get incredible lakes. And those are called rift lakes. Lake Baikal in Russia is a fantastic example of this. It contains nearly 20% of the world's fresh water. And up there, it drops to minus 30 in the winter, and the lake freezes thick enough that you can drive over it. You get all kinds of animals around there. You get bears and wolves and deer and moose and reindeer, all your ungulates, wolverine, lynx, foxes, etc. But you also get a very, very special seal up there called the nirpa, which is a freshwater seal. And they speculate that it evolved there because it was originally a saltwater seal that then got trapped there, washed up there by the river and just kind of hung out there in Baikal. And it evolved there as one of the world's very few, very rare freshwater seals. So your lakes like that can also become places where you have strange creatures that exist nowhere else because they are so isolated from the rest of the environment. So it becomes, like I discussed with islands, it becomes these places where evolution follows a different path because you have a more closed genetic pool. So your choices in natural selection are different from what it is anywhere else in the world, which is really fascinating, and you can have all kinds of creatures from it, including, of course, monstrous creatures and magical ones. Anyway, back to Baikal. Baikal also has an incredible cleaning system, which is mostly due to the zooplankton that exists in the lake. Now, the zooplankton in Baikal actually filters the entire body of the lake in 23 years. That entire massive body of fresh water, it filters in 23 years, which is why Baikal is such a clear lake. It's always transparent. You can always see through it, which is incredible. It also has bacteria that eats oil. Now, how they know this is because there is an oil seep, a natural oil seep at the bottom of Baikal. So the oil seeps up out of the earth into the lake, but it doesn't go any further. Why not? Because there are bacteria that live at the bottom of Baikal that eat the oil. They literally eat the oil of the plants. And that's just amazing. I just find that so incredibly amazing. So you can really kind of have these lakes that are so strange and different and have such a different environment because of their isolated nature, because they're built around fault lines in the earth. And again, Baikal has volcanoes under it, so it has thermal vents. It doesn't make much of an impact on the general temperature of the lake, but there are spots in Baikal where the water goes up to 50 degrees, even in winter, because of the volcanoes. So again, you can dive into that elemental magic where you've got all three working together. You've got the air, you've got water, you've got fire and earth, all of them working together in these spots, and they can be nexus spots for elemental magic. Also, those rare animals and plants that I spoke about, I mean, you can lean into that if you have a component-based magic system where people have to, go and gather the golden root under the light of the moon while the shaman plays his drum in order to make the potion that will give you superhuman strength. And that then gives a lot of significance to these places and gives people a reason to go there and gives these strange critters a tie into your magic system, which allows you to really build out this place that's part of your world. So that's rift lakes. Now I want to talk about a really strange type of lake, which is an intermittent lake. Now, I spoke about intermittent lakes a little with volcanoes. Sometimes the water seeps out. But the really awesome intermittent lake is in Brazil, among the dunes there. During the rainy season, the entire dune basin turns into a myriad of interconnected lakes with the dunes kind of like little sandy islands between them. It's amazing. It just turns into this huge lake. And then when the rainy season passes, the water drains away again. But the groundwater is always quite close to the surface. So when the rainy season comes again, it fills up and creates this intermittent lake. So the kind of life that exists here is life with a super short life cycle. So because you have to basically exist during the rainy season, you've got to find something, you've got to mate with it, you've got to put down a youngling probably in egg forms that can survive the dry season, and then you die. And then the next season, the rains come again, and the eggs hatch, and they have to go through the same cycle. So it's like a really accelerated life cycle. Or it's creatures that don't hibernate, but instead bury themselves in the mud and basically go into a state of kind of suspended animation during the heat of the dry season until the rains come again and reinvigorate them. So it makes for a very different environment in terms of whether it's wet or dry, because in the wet season you have to use a boat to get through the region. But in the dry season, it's like walking through a desert. And I find that is just a fascinating concept. So definitely think about intermittent lakes and how you can use them in your world. And then the last type of lake that I want to talk about is man-made lakes. Now, the best example in our world is Lake Nasser in Egypt. And basically it was made by diverting the Nile. What it achieved was it unshackled Egypt from the flood cycle of the Nile. It reduced Egypt's chance of flooding, and it reduced Egypt's chance of droughts. So really it did a lot for the people of Egypt. It also became a great stopover point for migratory birds, and the animals adapted really well to it. In fact, it probably saved the Nile crocodile and the Egyptian goose from going extinct. Hydroelectricity is generated via Lake Nasser, so enough to power most of Egypt, or at least it was when it was created. But on the downside, if you do such a thing, if you create a man-made lake, you can have dire consequences. So in Lake Nasser's case, it drowned Nubia, and thousands of Nubians had to be relocated into the desert, and it wasn't great. Also, the temples of Abu Simbel were in the valley, and they were just going to be drowned. And in the end, UNESCO moved those temples. They got 50 countries involved, and they actually cut the pillars into blocks and moved the whole blocks, moved all the temples out of the valley that was going to become Lake Nasser, and put them, in a safe location, in a reconstructed safe location. So you do have obvious and clear downsides if you create a lake artificially, in that you're basically drowning a whole region, right? Even though there are many upsides. So if you do create a man-made lake, make sure that you think of both the upsides and the downsides that your people are going to engage in. Okay, those were the lake types I wanted to cover. Hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed that. And let's talk about what lakes in general provide. So lakes are a buffer zone for your climate. The climate is generally more temperate around a lake because the water retains heat longer, so your winters aren't as harsh, and it doesn't heat up as fast, so your summers are more gradual and your summers are not as hot. So it can provide a temperate living zone in a dire environment where people can settle. It's also a critical part of bird migration. In fact, ospreys, for example, always return to the same nest. So their nests grow year on year where they are around a lake, and then they leave them when the chicks are growing and return to that same place to nest again. And then, of course, there are birds like cranes that migrate from lake to lake. So they need to go from one lake to another lake to rest and to, recuperate and then carry on. There are birds that don't migrate. The mute swan doesn't migrate, and it flocks together during the winter months on the ice. And there are duck species that do that as well. Interestingly, in the ducks, those flocks don't survive the spring. So they'll flock together for heat in the winter, and then when spring comes, they're like, yeah, no, now all that's important is mating, and the fact that we were all cuddly in winter does not influence my mating drive. It's interesting that those flocks, are only a winter activity. Anyway, speaking of ducks, the ducks are also provided with a place of safety in the lake. So when they're swimming on the lake, they are safer than when they are, say, grazing in the meadow where a wolf could come grab them. But of course, they still do have to go onto land to eat and so on. The moose goes into the water to eat. They eat pondweed from inside the lake, and they can actually swim and eat that, and they go after it for the minerals, which is very interesting. So a lake can provide food for the creatures that live around it, and it can provide a place of safety for the birds. It is also a place where there's often creatures that hibernate, and like, for example, when bears come out of hibernation, they look for the insects that live around the lake because they're starving, they're very emaciated, and they're not going to be able to hunt down prey. So they go looking for the first easiest food, which is always the insects around the lake. So a lake is a very rich biome, and it's a biome that kind of works together in a kind of temperate effect on the lake and the environment. It's also a place where strange animals can evolve, as we spoke about when we spoke about Baikal and the Nurple seal. So it's worth thinking about, what kind of strange animals and plants only exist in this specific lake. Okay, let's talk about lake magic and lake monsters. The most enduring myth about lakes is probably the Lady of the Lake from the Arthurian legends, and certainly that one has a myriad of versions. Essentially, there's a woman who probably held up a sword out of a lake and Arthur took it. Maybe she just lived near a lake and she gave it to him in her cottage. But I like the version where she, is pushing the sword up and he takes it. Actually, the version I like best is shown by David Gemmell. Now, what Gemmell did in his world was he actually used portal magic and the lake. So the Lady of the Lake who handed the sword up was actually in a completely different world. And she was lifted up by another dude with a sword in hand, and she, held up the sword like this, and just her arm stuck through the lake. And Arthur took the sword, and then she vanished back down, and she was just gone. So she was literally handing him the sword through a portal, which I thought was fascinating. Lakes, of course, do make for great portals. As I said, they can form these elemental nexus points, and in those elemental nexus points, you could have a gate to another world. I mean, you don't even have to have elemental magic. It could just be that the interaction creates that gate. And then, as I spoke about when I spoke about Lake Nassar, you can have hydroelectricity coming from lakes, which of course works in any world, whether you have magic or not. But you can also tie that into your magic. You can have that movement of water create power that the mage can use, as I spoke about when I did my video on 2 moons and the power of the tides that you can utilize in such a case. So definitely power generation, elemental magic and portal magic are great elements of lake magic. But you can also lean into the spiritual aspect. Shamans have been working around lakes for centuries. You can have spirits in the lake. You can have totemists. You can have totem animals who live in the lake. You can also lean into the monsters of the lake, things like grindylows, which are demons that live in the lake, or kappas that have water in bowls, and if the water is spilled out of their head bowls, then they lose their supernatural power. Or naiads, which come from the Greeks, which are spirits of the lake, or even freshwater mermaids that, might help people or might harm them if they try and harm the lake. So you can really lean into that animal spirit aspect of the lake and build out a shamanistic tradition around the lake. And those are my thoughts on lakes in fantasy worlds. If you enjoyed this episode, maybe check out how to create memorable physical landmarks. If you want to connect around this or any other topic, I do have a Discord server linked down below. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.